Chapter 10, After the War. Of course, IBM is entangled in this larger narrative, a hot pog, in many more ways than I've covered in these 6 chapters here, where I've focused only on their role in World War II and the Holocaust. They will still play an important part in different aspects of the story, but to conclude this saga, let's look at what happened at the end of the war. To be fair, to be very fair, by focusing on IBM in the way that I've done, you might get the mistaken impression that IBM was unique in their profiteering and collaboration with Hitler's Germany. They were far from being the only ones. The Third Reich was a real international effort. Some companies merely turned a blind eye to the crimes of the Nazis because they just couldn't bear to lose them as customers, like Coca-Cola or Kodak. Others went above and beyond, just like IBM, and made contributions that one could argue were comparably significant to extending the duration of the war and multiplying human misery. Ford is one of the more well-known examples. Before dragging their feet on contributing to the American war effort, they were producing a whole host of vehicles, machines, and spare parts for the Nazis. General Motors, too, provided passenger vehicles to the SS, the Wehrmacht, and others in the Nazi Party. Chase Bank, similarly, went out of their way to make it possible for German Americans to buy Nazi war bonds and thus directly financially support the Nazis. Standard Oil, Texas Oil Company, and Texaco went to great lengths to circumvent laws and embargoes in order to keep literally fueling the German war machine. The provision of fuel by these companies is estimated alone to have extended the war by 2 years. To name all of the international collaborators would be to explode the scope of this chapter, but these might be some of the most egregious examples. All of these companies deserve to be called out, but there's still something that sets IBM apart from these companies. You see, while all of the companies that I just mentioned were sanctioned or fined by the American government for their collaboration in crimes against humanity, IBM was let completely off the hook. As soon as Allied forces started liberating concentration camps, they would come across the punch card machines with IBM's logo emblazoned on them. In some cases, Nazis had been able to destroy cards and machines in an attempt to purge evidence of their crimes once it became clear that they were about to lose the war. But plenty of cards and machines survived. GIs would not have understood the significance of these devices, as few in the general population were even aware of punch card technology at all. A few high-ranking officials did understand the significance. Justice was, however, not the only consideration in parsing the aftermath of the war for the Americans. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, the US, for example, helped the infamous torturer Klaus Barbie escape to South America, and this was hardly an exception. Among the more well-known examples of Nazi rehabilitation, the case of Werner von Braun and his ilk was among the most notorious. These Nazi rocket scientists would go on to play an important role in founding NASA and conducting the moon landing. Look up Operation Paperclip if you want to learn more about that. When it came to IBM, the major problem in sanctioning them stemmed from how deeply they were now woven into the fabric of the German economy. From industry to infrastructure to government administration, punch cards, holoroot machines, were now as essential to keeping Germany from collapsing in peacetime as they had been to keeping Germany's war effort alive. You have to assume that Watson's connections to the State Department were also not unhelpful in protecting his company from consequences. And so it was, in any case, that IBM not only got off with no sanctions or even press attention, and not only did they go on to collect on all of the profits made while their subsidiaries were under Nazi control, but beyond that, they were granted many expensive reparations for lost, stolen, or damaged machines in almost all of the countries they had been operating in. European countries, huh? Thomas Watson's gamble had paid off in a more spectacular way than he could possibly have imagined. Before I end this section, one thing still sticks out to me as deserving of mention. The author of the book that uncovered all of what I've spoken about here, Edwin Black, had been very careful about avoiding any leaks during his research. Gathering and parsing all of this data was a huge effort that involved the collaboration of many international researchers, and this was all done over the span of 2 years. Some of the main reasons he didn't want any information to leak was so that all of his claims could be double and triple checked and well substantiated, and so that the press and the public were at once provided with the whole story, rather than small parts of the story making sporadic headlines and lessening the punch. And he almost succeeded in this. Almost. IBM had denied Edwin Black access to their archives, right, during his research. Obviously, you might say. But, I mean, of course, anybody writing such a book would make such a request. Given what we now know, you would have to assume that IBM's own archives would give quite a lot of insight into their collaboration with Hitler in the day, though they deny it. A week before Edwin Black's book would be released, simultaneously with many translations thereof, worldwide, it was IBM itself who would leak the story to the press in a last-ditch effort to slightly reduce the impact of it. When the book was released in 2001, it did draw quite a bit of attention. The revelation of this ubiquitous computer company being so deeply involved in the Holocaust was shocking to the general public. And yet, perhaps because it's a difficult story to summarize, or because the provisioning of machines is hard to consider an offense comparable to, say, the pulling of triggers, or the garroting of prisoners, or perhaps because only shortly after the book's release, 9/11 happened, and people were more focused on the next war than any previous ones. Whatever the reason, the story of IBM and the Holocaust doesn't seem to have made it into broad public awareness. IBM commissioned a puff piece to be written about their beloved Thomas Watson, called The Maverick and His Machine, right? Which was released only a year later after Edwin Black's book. The book is an extremely tedious read, and I would characterize it as an attempt to mythologize the man and to excuse, downplay, or redirect any responsibility for his actions. They were clearly not at all ready to throw him under the bus, even though he'd been dead since 1956. What's more, Watson, to this day, is a name that is closely tied to the IBM brand. Remember when IBM made that robot that participated in Jeopardy in 2011? And the robot was named Watson, right? After the man, pictured here. I'm sorry, there's two men. He's the one that's not Hitler. The question answering AI powering the robot Watson is also called Watson, and if you like, you can go to IBM's website or whatever and buy access to Watson right now. The point is, IBM has not reckoned with their problematic past, which, by the way, does not end with World War II. For example, as the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that is going to come up at some point, pointed out in 2015, IBM deserves criticism too for their role in South African apartheid. That also needed administration, right? A subject that still lacks a comprehensive investigation. In the early days, while the company was growing into a giant under Thomas Watson's direction, his employees would sing songs about him all day, and they basically never stopped. Now, why should anybody care? Why should we care about IBM's involvement in the Holocaust? Why should you? I can't tell you that, I'm afraid. But here's why I care. IBM, more than any other company, rang in the information age. And the Holocaust, based on everything I've discussed here, can plausibly be described as the first big, comprehensive, big data project. To me, the fact of this automated data processing was a hugely important missing puzzle piece in comprehending how the Holocaust could be carried out at all. The stories of René Carmi and Jacobus Lenz reveal the mostly invisible power held by engineers and inform me on what kind of engineer I would like to be. These days, punch cards are not so popular anymore. But instead of the presence or absence of a hole in a card, we have zeros and ones. At the dawn of our age, a hole in a card might mean that a human being will live or die. And you do have to wonder, how many zeros and ones out there mean the same today? Now, that was going to be the end of the chapter. But I recently learned a few things that I think are interesting, and I'd like to shoehorn in here. First, there's the case of a refugee. You know who managed to get out of Germany in 1939 and thus saved his life? Ralph Ansbach, who you might remember from chapter 4. I wonder whether this aspect of his biography might explain something about where the man got his sense of justice. Anyway, thought that was interesting. Thought that I'd bring it up. And secondly, Robert Carmi, René Carmi's son, whose story I discussed in the previous chapter. In the 90s, in the op-ed that he wrote criticizing these historians who mischaracterized his father's life and work, he expressed appreciation for Thomas Watson, American tycoon, in that same op-ed. And the reason for this has to do with another interesting fact about René Carmi. So while in this time where he was subverting the French Jewish census, René Carmi thought that there was no way IBM knew that their technology was being used to orchestrate a genocide. At a great risk to his own safety, Carmi decided to forge documents to travel with a false identity to a place called Annemasse near the Swiss border to meet with the manager of the Belgian IBM subsidiary, who was located in Switzerland at the time. He did this in order to leak to IBM the horrible truth about how the punch card machines were being used and to what ends. After the war, in October 1945, Thomas Watson had an envoy sent over to France to express gratitude for this action to Carmi's surviving wife and child, the child being Robert Carmi. Given what we've learned from Edwin Black's research, you have to assume that René Carmi couldn't have conveyed any information that Thomas Watson wasn't already privy to. What's certain is that Watson didn't act act on that information, at least beyond saying thanks. But as stated, Carmi Jr.'s op-ed was from 1996, which was 5 years before Edwin Black's book was published. Now, I haven't been able to find any statement from Robert Carmi from after the publishing of IBM and the Holocaust, though I tend to assume he must have at least been aware of it. And I don't know, I wonder how he reacted to it. But what gets me about this story is this. How is the son of arguably one of the greatest heroes of the 20th century humbled all his life by the fact that Thomas Watson sent him a thank you note? I mean, we in the West have a tendency to lionize and to mythologize the winners of our stupid game. And so Thomas Watson, to many of us, was this larger-than-life figure who dragged humanity into a new age by the sweat of his brow. But to some of us, you know, knowing what we know, Thomas Watson looks more like a spineless opportunist who got rich from making a website for Hitler. Who's to say? I'll be taking next week off, all right? Because I'm just buried in work at the moment. But I'll see you in 2 weeks. And I'm sure we're gonna get to GAFAM any day now. Go in peace. And long live René Carmi.